Life is returning to the land. I can feel the sap rising in the plants, in the hedgerows. I can feel the sap rising in me. It's a gorgeous sight to see lambs in the fields again. So I'm sorry I haven't posted for a week and a half. I had the galloping trots. So galloping, I could have come in the top 3 on the 2:15 at Newmarket. And oh look, there's a hawk over there. Anyway, but so it's a short walk as I recover. I do 3 or 4 miles and then go home. But this video is about common land, and common land in the Dark Ages, into the Middle Ages, and what it means to us today and why we don't have it anymore. The Charter of Westwood, Saxon Charter. Saxon Charters are basically the deeds for land, and they say what the circumstances, what taxes you have to pay and so on, but also show the limits of the land that you own, and so they describe in Dark Age language the landscape. We're seeing it through their eyes 1,000 and more years ago. And it talks of, right at the end it says that on the other side of on the bit that's dealt by the River Froom, from that there is a Yamana Londe, and that means mean land, common land. When we say things are, things are mean, that is they're lowly. And though this land would have been very valuable, because it was held in common, it wasn't really valued that much. Though where I am now is meadow, and it is, we know from medieval documents that meadow is the most valuable land. You sell it for the most amount of money, and it might be to do with the fact that it just doesn't need fertilising. It's the only part of if you go for a walk in a meadow next to a river in August, you will see it's still green, whereas the rest of the land has gone yellow. It's gone cream coloured and browning and dried out, but the meadow hasn't, and it's very, very fertile. And that's why we're on the meadow of of Fernley. It calls it Fernlech, which means the clearing or woodland of ferns. Today is Hungerford, Farley, Hungerford Farley. So Yemene Lande is land that is held in common. So the two estates, the common people of the two estates, would share it, and which is an idea that's quite alien to us today, in the sense that every part of Britain is owned by the state or by individuals or trusts and so on. But they are owned. It's private property, every inch, and but nonetheless there is an ideology developing of the idea of the commons, a modern idea of the commons, which is very different from the commons of medieval times and post-medieval times, implying that the public have free access, the right to go hither and thither across it, and to enjoy its amenities. But in medieval times, common land was held for productive reasons. It was to browse your ducks and geese on, and your sheep and your cows, and it had particular rules that self-governed, incidentally. So in the proper medieval period, we know about manor courts, and they were even unfree tenants, people who could never leave their village, are members of could be members of those juries and manorial courts, and held everybody to account. Now there's a certain, it's not exactly democracy, because there was no chance of reforming their society in a meaningful way. They couldn't reform away the dues to their lord, but they made sure that nobody did less than anybody else, and everybody pulled their weight. And let's think that this is not too onerous. You will be aware that the value of your labour, a certain amount is taken and given to the state. It's called taxation. The same is done in the manorial system. You would give labour, which could be commuted to payment in lieu, money or produce from your own land. But you had the whole point of a manor is to sustain the people, and sustain a fighting man that would be available to the king to fight his wars. And even the church, when it was a landowner, had to do this. This is one of the reasons that I disappoint people talking about the Reformation and the dissolution of the monasteries, is that the church diluted the fighting spirit of the country. That old fighting men sold their armour and their spear and gave it to the church along with their land. It diluted the transmission of a martial culture. So when the Vikings came along, they were not as strong as they could have been. The same thing happened in the Roman Empire. So as much as I appreciate the certain elements of church culture, its actions as a landowner had to be reformed for the sake of the survivability, the ability to make policy decisions, for the state to make policy decisions for the country. It didn't get diluted by a second power, and I still maintain that. But it's very interesting, the local democracy element of manor court. So it would administer where there's an open field system, where the land was held in common, arable land was held in common, ploughed together, and it was you were given a random plot or two each year, and if you encroached on another person's plot, a jury would come along and fine you. It was self-administered, self-management, and this goes along with some anarcho-communist ideas from people like Kropotkin, anarcho-primitivist ideas today, talking about self-management, the struggle to fight against the monopoly of the land and capital in all its forms, and give it back to democratic institutions at the local level. And we're seeing that in certain organisations, like I think we're seeing that in organisations like Right to Roam. So before I start whopping Right to Roam over the head, I'd like to talk about why we don't have land in common anymore. There are a few places, Port Meadow in Oxford, just outside Oxford, it still is held in common, but it's a bunch of middle class people that own it in common. And you will see this in the book The Making of the English Landscape, where he shows how the local landlords resisted enclosure, didn't go for enclosure because it suited their vanity to keep it. So they liked to have a few sheep and a few bits of cattle out on a nice green space, unspoilt by working class tenements. So there was situations where cities needed to expand to prevent disease, so that people weren't overcrowded, and it was common land can't be sold for building houses on. It had to be used by law for the purpose, which is to grow grain for the people or keep cattle fat. So places like Port Meadow, I suspect that's the reason why Port Meadow in Oxford still is held in common, and I'm sure not all of the people who work who graze cattle and horses there are middle class, but I suspect they have a vested interest in a bucolic idyll on their doorstep. But in other places, the fight against enclosure led to hardship, misery, disease and death. Towns weren't able to expand, and therefore sometimes the fight against the commons, the destruction of the commons, was a regressive anti-working class action. But the common land is in the early 1800s, when we're just getting the records of the change from an open landscape that's held in common to a privatised one that's hedged in. There's those private lands are 20% more efficient. They produce more grain, which begs the question: why did the common land system, the open field system, a little piece of communism in medieval Britain, why did it carry on for the hundreds of years it did? The answer is because holding land in common protects against starvation. It acts as it hedges the bets of people trying to avoid crop failure by having such a large expanse, so many plots, all with grain sown on them. Some of them are going to survive, and it was that's probably why. I mean, nobody's more greedy than the English. They knew their greed could get them into trouble. So they also had private little plots as well. There were many enclosed areas for hundreds of years. But it was a system that, though inefficient, protected them when nobody else would. They had only themselves to look to give themselves the resources to survive a dangerous and unforgiving world. Now, when we get to the post-medieval period, improvements in agriculture mean that the old system, you can't let, you've improved your land, and then custom demands that the local villagers get to forage on your land after harvest. So you put all that effort into improving it, and others come along and unimprove it and or disimprove it. This is why there was an impetus to privatise, to go for the enclosure acts. Now, the hard left among you, I used to be one, will tell you there was resistance to the enclosures. There was in the 1500s. There were acts by landlords that were entirely illegal, that disappropriated ordinary working people from their own land, and violence took place. The old pitchforks came out. But later on, the legal enclosures, there was hardly any. There doesn't seem to be. There's one or two, but they're sort of right on the outliers. So enclosure compensation was given. So if you had the right to, graze your geese on the heath, up on the heathland, the commissioners would come along and say, I'll give you an eighth an acre, whatever, and you don't have to graze geese anymore. You can do whatever you like with it. And of course, people accepted it. Well, they argued, and there was backstabbing and all the rest of it. And I'm sure one or two people didn't get what they deserved. But overall, there wasn't a revolt. So it's much like redundancy in your workplace. Somebody announces redundancies, everybody panics, and then suddenly people start rubbing their hands and going, can I have a copy of the policy, please? How much am I going to get? And that's pretty much, again, the English system. You buy people off. So, anarcho-communists and anarcho-primitivists. So, the demand for greater access for us today, we have a lot of access to the countryside. You'll see all the hundreds of videos. I very rarely go off piste. I occasionally get lost. I almost never deliberately wander off where I'm not supposed to be. That's normally because a river's broken its banks or something like that. But I am ready to admit we need more footpaths, especially around land that used to be parkland in the 19th century. Mysteriously, land that belonged to really rich, influential people seemed to have less footpaths than everybody else. And that needs redressing. So you get these great big deserts of footpaths around great big country houses. Not all of them, but sometimes you do. And that needs redressing. And you could radicalise me and say, we need more than that, Tom, and I'd go, do you know what, why not all of those marked tracks on the map that we're not allowed to go down? Why can't we? Why not? So there are improvements that can be made improvements can be made for public access to the landscape. But taking the Scottish idea that you can wander over anybody's land wherever you like, whenever you like, even with the provisos that Right to Roam say, like you're not allowed to go into land that's got a crop in it, it's still a smack across the mouth of every single farmer in this country. And don't come to me with those quislings you've managed to find that don't care. You know, the llama farmers. The Scottish farmers have had enough of it. They want it gone. And quite frankly, if you were trying to eke out a business and people kept doing whatever they liked when you're trying to do stuff, you'd be annoyed with it too. It isn't yours, it doesn't belong to you. You shouldn't have the unfettered access to it. When you don't manage it, you're not a custodian of it, you don't improve it, and you haven't bought it. So I disagree with it, but there is more that we can do. And there's other aspects that people aren't thinking about. So on Paul Whitewick interviewed Right to Roam the other day, a really enjoyable video, thoroughly enjoyed it. And see, look, a river's broke its banks. Well, it's flooded anyway. I might not be able to go any further. I'm having to go. Let's see how far I can get. No, that's fine. So he interviewed the Right to Roam people, and they of course pointed out that only a tiny amount of tiny amount of people in Scotland owned all of the land, like 300 or whatever. And that might be true, but it's not the whole truth. And that really annoys me. That they should tell, what about all the thousands of tenants, the ones who are actually working the land? Have you asked them? You know, have you considered them? You know, we're not being told the whole truth. So as part of Paul's video, he's talking about all of the barrows that are prevented from being ploughed up by scheduling. This is the Ancient Monuments Act or something along those lines. The government pays them to stop ploughing that land, which is why you'll see like a square of grass in a field of arable with a barrow in the middle of it. And nobody's suggested, they've gone straight to the revolutionary, let's do whatever we like with other people's land, and hasn't considered that there are equitable and negotiated ways around this problem. And that is, if you want to go and see barrows and earthworks of all kinds, and they've been scheduled and they're under a countryside stewardship agreement, which means the farmer won't plough it anymore, then you can access it too. There should be a pathway to it, and that should be built into the contract. Now you think, why would the farmer go along with that? You know, loads of them are going to stop doing it. All our barrows are going to be ploughed, except the government pays them with these countryside stewardship agreements. Now, I don't know all the facts. I need to do more research. I knew they got some sort of payment, but anyway, yeah. So that's my solution, and that's what I think. This is why I'm not in favour of it.